Content warning. This episode contains heavy and potentially graphic discussions of suicide. Listener discretion is advised.
Also, neither of us have any background that sets us up to speak on the subject outside of a Buddhist context. We don't have the psychological or medical training for that.
If you or somebody you know has suicidal thoughts, ideation, or behaviors, you can call, text, or chat with 988 if you live in the US, or with your local suicide hotline if you live elsewhere. Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, have you ever known anybody to take their own life?
I have. An older relative of my mother before I was born, and a friend I studied with in university.
I'm sorry to hear that. Suicide is so complicated. There are many reasons why one might do such a thing, but only one outcome in any case. Because of this singular outcome, I wonder if the reason one does it even matters.
What would the Buddha say about suicide?
He would say that suicide due to depression, due to a strong desire to not be alive anymore, is bad karma. However, willful sacrifice of oneself in the name of the salvation of all sentient beings is heavily encouraged. It is important not to become overly attached to keeping your body or to shedding it away. The most wholesome and important attachment is attachment to the Dharma, to the path of saving all beings everywhere. Detesting this life is not very different karmically from indulging in it to the point of being addicted to it.
Fascinating. It seems there's such a fine line between desiring for your own extinction through nirvana or desiring it through suicide.
It is a very fine line, but in that line that divides them is contained the entire Dharma, so it is a vast line as well. Those who seek nirvana do not seek to die. They seek to never again be reborn as a result of good works, practice, and study.
And on the other hand, those who seek to die want an escape from this world rather than a perfected existence in it. It's a fine line, but a sharp and vivid one.
Precisely.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we will be discussing suicide in Buddhism. How ought we understand suicide in Buddhism? When is it acceptable and unacceptable, and why? How has this interacted with and been influenced by culture? Thank you for listening. So, how ought we understand suicide in Buddhism?
This is a heavy and difficult topic, but it's one that religious systems must deal with and speak to because it's something that happens, and it is a different type of death from dying of natural causes or being killed by somebody else. As a result, it gets its own designated discourse in doctrinal texts. In the vast majority of world religions, suicide is regarded as being an immoral act, though the reasons can differ from faith to faith. In Abrahamic religions, your life is seen as a gift from God, and to kill yourself is to reject that gift. In Confucianism, the same is true, except that the body and your life are seen as gift from your ancestors. In both cases, suicide lands you in hell after you die. In South Asian religions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, suicide is usually seen as an act of violence, an expression of selfishness and desire, and as an insult to your family, so it typically lands you in a poorer reincarnation. They come up with different explanations for why that is, but most agree that the act of dispensing with one's life and their body due to selfish reasons stains the soul morally. Zooming in on Buddhism a little bit, suicide violates the first precept, ahimsa, or nonviolence. This precept prohibits all killing of living things, and since we are all living things, we are prohibited by that precept from killing ourselves, just like we are prohibited from killing each other. It is not just a matter of killing either. We are actually prohibited from all acts of violence against ourselves and against others. You will remember that violence in Buddhism is defined as any act which causes harm or an overall unpleasant experience to the object of that violence. So, not only is murder and suicide prohibited, but so too is deliberate self-harm or attempted suicide of any kind. If you accidentally stub your toe, or get a really bad paper cut, or even do something even more severe that leads potentially to your accidental death, that does not necessarily cause bad karma to you. However, if you exact some sort of physical or psychological harm to yourself on purpose, that's bad karma. In that regard, self-harm and self-negligence, such as smoking cigarettes, neglecting one's health, drinking excessively, etc., are all bad karma. However, it's an open question if they are worse karma than the act of hastily ending one's own life or not. There is no specific way given in the texts to know whether the collective violence of a lifetime of alcoholism, drug addiction, or cigarette addiction measures up to more or less bad karma than jumping off a bridge. The only way we could know the measure of all karma in all situations is to become enlightened. We should keep in mind that the slower forms of suicide, self-harm, and self-negligence I mentioned are addiction-related, and addiction creates a huge amount of opportunity to harm the person suffering from the addiction and the others around them. For example, a lifetime of alcoholism is very harmful to one's own body and is to be understood as an illness that is incredibly difficult and arduous to live through and overcome. It is also harmful and difficult for people close to the addicted person. For example, severe alcoholism usually involves drunk driving at one time or the other, and so if somebody drunk drives and hits somebody else on the road, then not only is the alcoholism bad karma, but so too is hitting somebody while drunk driving. In our modern and Western context, there's a huge societal and cultural effort being made to reframe addiction as an illness that deserves treatment, resuscitation, and rehabilitation, rather than thinking of it as a character flaw that deserves punishment and reprimand. I fully support this. However, the Buddhist texts do not regard addiction in this way. Of course, all sentient beings are deserving of loving kindness and compassion, but the very presence of addiction in one's life is seen as being that person's own fault due to their bad karma or their succumbing to attachment in some severe way. For more on how Buddhism treats mental health, you can check out episode 13. The link will be in the show notes. Back to the topic at hand. Suicide is bad karma and an expression of extreme selfish desire. The idea is that to desire death is to reify the self. This seems counterintuitive at first. You may be thinking, desiring death is to desire the erasure of the self, not to reify the self. But the texts claim that being suicidal reifies the self because it assumes that there is a self to erase or do away with. It assumes that there is a self that can die. Buddhism teaches that there is no such self. Thinking that there is perpetuates delusion, which can cause people to become encumbered with severe desire. In the context of suicide, this desire could be extreme aversion to the conditions in one's life or desire for something in any kind of afterlife that one doesn't have. It is seen as desiring for the total absence of unpleasantness. As a result, it is karmically negative. However, reincarnation complicates things. Obviously, if it leads to a worse reincarnation, suicide is a poor solution to whatever problems one is facing. However, in Pure Land Buddhism, it is argued that Amida's infinite compassion causes us to have faith in our ability to be reborn in his Pure Land when we die. That renders it much easier to undergo a favorable rebirth in his Pure Land from this realm. Moreover, there is the idea, especially in medieval Japanese Pure Land, that Amida's compassion extends even more to immoral beings because they need the help the most. In that regard, because it is dualistic, relative, and contextually defined, morality's role as a means of attaining rebirth in the Pure Land is reimagined. How does suicide factor in that regard? You remember that there are 9 levels of rebirth in the Pure Land, and they're separated into a hierarchy based on how immoral people were in this life. The lowest 3 levels are all reserved for people who were evil or harmful in their lives in some way. When they pass away, they will not be welcomed into the Pure Land by Amida or any of his bodhisattva attendants, and they will be reborn in a lotus bud that won't open for some huge amount of time. During the time that they are in that lotus bud, they can't hear the Dharma or do anything. It's like a period of gestation in humans. There's no awareness, no memory, and no experience until the flower opens. For some, this seems like a much better option than whatever they're going through in this life, especially if their circumstances are leading them to consider suicide. However, that doesn't mean that Pure Land Buddhism favors or encourages suicide. For one thing, the influence of Confucianism means that suicide is still strongly looked down upon among Pure Land Buddhists. Additionally, it is still seen as an immoral act of violence and harm, which should be avoided regardless of if Amida has your back. The Buddha teaches that being reborn into a heaven where you have a perfect healthy body and get to listen to the Dharma all day every day until you reach final nirvana is strongly favorable to long-term oblivion or purgatory until your bud blossoms.
When is suicide acceptable and unacceptable in Buddhism, and why?
This is a super complicated question. For one thing, it's important to remember that we simply can't know if dying by suicide has a different result than dying by any other way. We are relying entirely on religious, unfalsifiable claims about death for this discussion. Keeping that in mind, also remember that suicide has the broad definition of killing oneself on purpose, and we have spent the whole episode saying that that is a bad thing. This definition, however, also captures and includes self-immolation and self-sacrifice. Self-sacrifice through self-immolation, through giving up your body in some way to other living beings in need or as an offering to the Buddha, is regarded as a highly virtuous act that acts like a rocket ship to a favorable rebirth or even to Buddhahood. So you might be tempted to think that suicide is acceptable when it's done as an act of sacrifice for all sentient beings, an expression of universal compassion and non-self. This would make some sense. Recognizing non-self, surrendering attachment to one's physical body because you know that it doesn't constitute a capital S self, and then selflessly giving that body in the name of sustenance for others seems like a highly virtuous thing to do. However, ritualized suicide is not terribly common in Buddhism throughout history, and when it has occurred, you could argue that many of the observable cases were situations where the intent was not sacrifice, compassion, or non-self. For example, there are some accounts of soldiers in medieval battles in Japan killing themselves on the battlefield while chanting the Nenbutsu. I should note here that the seppuku, or the harakiri, that many of us are familiar with does not have a religious context at all. That was a form of ritualized capital punishment. It was very performative and served to perpetuate a particular social order that was maintained by wealthy, powerful elites who were all ruthlessly competing for wealth, power, and resources. I'm referring specifically to accounts of soldiers committing suicide on the battlefield, not in the context of being punished for their acts while fighting, not in the context of performing and perpetuating a social order, but as a means of seeking repentance and rebirth in the Pure Land. Particularly aged veteran soldiers would stop fighting, perhaps when the tide of a battle turned against them, or when they had just finished killing a lot of people very quickly, and they would begin chanting Nenbutsu, and then kill themselves on the battlefield. The Nenbutsu chanting suggests that these soldiers desire to be reborn in Amida's Pure Land. Is this practice supported by the doctrines, providing absolution for their violent acts? There's debate about that, but most Pure Land thinkers would say no, this did not work for them. Their karma from being a soldier was too bad, or perhaps they were so prideful that they refused to die by anybody else's hand but their own. There are also accounts of Japanese Pure Land aspirants sailing down the river in Kumano, this famous region in Japan, because it was seen as a portal to Amida's Pure Land. Interestingly, this is thought to have worked because of the sacredness of the site of Kumano, and because of the fact that usually monastic people were the ones doing this. So it wasn't people who made a career out of killing, and it wasn't people who it was very likely were dealing with suicidal thoughts. These monastics, near the end of their lives, would engage in ascetic practices for a very long time, and then get on a wooden boat on the river and sail down the river and out into the ocean until dying of drowning, starvation, thirst, or natural causes. The form of the ritual was very similar to Viking funerals, and sometimes even included a boat being shot with a flaming arrow. The only difference is that the passengers on the boat were alive. These ritualized suicides were thought to have delivered the passengers to the Pure Land because they would sail out west, and the Pure Land is to the western direction. We should also mention, of course, kamikaze pilots during World War II. These were also ritualized suicides, but they were committed with the thought process that the intent and the ramifications of their suicide rendered it sacrificial, and that their sacrifice would deliver them to a heavenly rebirth. The pilots, believing that they were giving their lives in the name of a living god, the emperor, were surrendering their attachment to their own lives in the interest of a greater good, which was the expansion of the Japanese Empire, which in their minds was a Shinto and partially Buddhist empire. From a Buddhist point of view, these were similar to soldiers killing themselves on the battlefield, except in this case they were also killing enemy combatants at the same time. In this regard, they likely accrued a great deal of bad karma. However, interestingly, as a side note, these pilots were enshrined in the Shinto religion. For more on that, you can listen to our Asian religion series on Shinto. So when is suicide acceptable and unacceptable? There's no easy answer. Text is mostly clear on the issue, stating that the difference is in the intention and the desire, or lack thereof, of the person doing the act. History is far less clear, however, acknowledging that there were people who believed that they could kill themselves on a battlefield and be reborn in a heaven-like realm, or those who killed themselves believing that they could sail to the Pure Land as though it was a real place past the horizon. What is their status? It's impossible to say for sure. This sort of encapsulates the whole problem of suicide from a philosophy standpoint or an ethics standpoint. When somebody attempts suicide and fails, they are still here to face consequences that we can impose on them. However, when they succeed, they're not here to face any living world consequences, and we don't know how things go for them in what comes after.
What about assisted suicide?
Assisted suicide, meaning a situation where a physician assists a terminally ill patient in dying because they suffer from prolonged and extreme pain and suffering, is a uniquely Western phenomenon. It stems from a utilitarian philosophical approach to medicine. Utilitarian philosophy is the ethical code of doing the best for the most, minimizing harm as much as possible. In this context, it is about minimizing harm, particularly in a medical hospital setting. Allowing somebody to linger in extreme pain and suffering when there is no chance of recovery is seen as allowing harm to occur. As a result, there are some states in the US and some countries which allow physician-assisted suicide. The conditions required to access assisted suicide vary from region to region, but they're all very strict. The regulations in these states in the US require all parties to prove that the condition causing the suffering is definitively terminal, that the patient is not young, that the patient is in their right mind to give informed consent about the procedure, and that there is literally no other available method to remedy the patient's pain. This filter is highly subjective and exclusive on purpose, because the line between physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia is very fine. No physician on earth who is worth their salt would want to cross that line, and the law does not permit any possibility of crossing it. You may see in this regulation description that a patient has to not be suicidal to get physician-assisted suicide in most cases. But if you're in the process of getting physician-assisted suicide, one can make the argument that you're taking steps to end your life, and thus ought to be disqualified from getting physician-assisted suicide. Mental health can't really work as a metric because of the psychological damage done by prolonged and extreme suffering due to one's terminal condition. These contradictions mean fewer and fewer people can get physician-assisted suicide, and that, again, is on purpose. Governments and healthcare professionals don't want people getting it all the time. The idea is that it is a slippery slope. They don't want to allow just any sick or suffering person to get assisted suicide because in cases where somebody's immediate pain is very high but temporary, some who would otherwise recover may think assisted suicide is the better option. Similarly, the state wants to avoid leaving any legal room for euthanasia. They want to make sure no physician would ever get away with killing somebody in a medical context for reasons unrelated to or contrary to the patient and their family's wishes. By contrast, physician-assisted suicide is illegal in all Asian countries. The influence of Confucianism and Buddhism in Asian cultures seems to outweigh the utilitarian approach to medicine, so there's no possibility of legal physician-assisted suicide in those places. Religious institutions standing in opposition to assisted suicide is common, including in the West. Abrahamic religious institutions are some of the biggest opponents to the implementation and legalization of physician-assisted suicide, but utilitarianism seems to have won out in some places because it is really difficult, nigh impossible, for people who identify with Abrahamic religions to justify why they think somebody who is terminally and untreatably ill should suffer for an unnecessarily long period of time outside of a religious context.
What about self-immolation?
Self-immolation is very fascinating. We've done an episode on it already, and I'll have the link to that in the show notes, but we can discuss it here because it is a ritualized form of suicide. Most recorded cases of self-immolation that happen within or beside a Buddhist tradition have had to do with a great sacrifice for the sake of all living things. Self-immolations, such as the famous one committed by the Vietnamese monk Thich Quang Duc as protest against the Vietnam War, that was seen as the ultimate sacrifice of his body, the ultimate sacrifice of his life for the sake of sending a message. And that message was nonviolence, was the Dharma. That message was there is an intense amount of violence, an intense amount of killing going on during this Vietnam War, and in order to demonstrate that that is simply not worth it, not something that we should be doing, that's not something that is ethical or moral in any way, I'm going to shed my physical body, I'm going to shed my life in order to shock people, in order to raise awareness to people, in order to show the gravity of this issue to people all around the world. One of the most important points of self-immolation is that it is a ritual that has to be seen. If you immolate behind closed doors, there's no message being delivered. It's just one-way communication. The ritual relies on two-way communication. And in the case of Thich Quang Duc, he was very much seen undertaking this incredibly sacrificial ritual. The photograph taken by Time magazine of him committing this ritual has become one of the most widely seen photographs of all time. And it also became so popular that it became the album cover for a Rage Against the Machine album, showing how popular it was for the counterculture movement. It was also a very strong contributor in its time to the rise of the hippie movement, where people in the United States came to protest the violence and the senselessness of the Vietnam War and Nixon's policies on Vietnam. This movement was also strongly influential on other political issues, such as the legalization of marijuana. Many of the hippie movement's anti-war politics and the legalization of marijuana remain a part of our discourse in politics even to this day. And so, I think that it's safe to say that the message was received, or at least the message kind of lived on after Thich Quang Duc had committed his self-immolation. And in that regard, I think that self-immolation, though it is ritualized suicide, and though it does come from a strong desire, is regarded differently in Buddhism because it comes from a desire not that reifies the self, not that expresses discontentment or depression or aversion to the everyday life, the circumstances we have. It actually reflects a desire to save all sentient beings and to perpetuate and ignite the Dharma and enlightenment in people who witness the act. We talked in that episode about how witnessing the act of self-sacrifice is kind of an important part of it. You have to see this sacrifice happen in order for the message to get across. If you immolate yourself behind closed doors, nobody really knows that you did it or why you did it, and the circumstances are completely lost. And so that interaction between the viewer and the person doing the sacrifice is a very important part about how self-immolation, self-sacrifice, can possibly be a very highly virtuous and meritorious act.
How has this interacted with and been influenced by different cultures?
The problem extends beyond a religious context. It has cultural, societal, and practical implications on the real world. For example, South Korea is a culture influenced strongly by Buddhism, and yet it has the second highest suicide rate in the entire world. This is due to factors outside of Buddhism. For example, there's a huge emphasis on examinations as a vehicle of career success. That is, middle schoolers take serious exams to try and get into good high schools. High school students try to take serious exams to get into good colleges. And college students take serious exams to get into good jobs. The stress of this system, which is called an escalator system, drives suicide rates up to horribly high levels among young people. Then, once people have jobs, the work culture makes it so that they are expected to work upwards of 100 hours a week with no overtime, regardless of how much of that they're paid for. Similarly, there is a lot of social pressure to have children and to put them through the escalator system as well. There's a lot of burden on the parents to get tutors and to pay for all the resources necessary to pass those tests. However, the parents aren't paid enough to support that lifestyle, so the workforce is shrinking and not being replaced because people are having fewer and fewer children. This is leading to a strained economy, which further increases the stress and pressure of people who are currently in the labor force to take up the slack with lower wages and higher labor and productivity. This drives many adults to suicide. To put the cherry on top, the World Population Review, which keeps track of various statistics such as suicide, gender inequality, and work culture, ranks South Korea as 105th out of the 146 countries surveyed in terms of gender equality, putting it behind most developed countries and driving a lot of women to suicide. This story is similar in Japan, except that there, measures have been taken by the government to help curtail the suicide problem, leading to their suicide rate to fall from previously very high levels in the 1990s and 2000s. Other cultures that are strongly influenced by Mahayana Buddhism, such as China and Vietnam, do not have suicide problems to the same degree as Korea and Japan, but they all do grapple with suicide in similar societal, political, practical, and cultural manners. In these places, there's a huge social stigma against suicide because of the influence of Confucianism and Buddhism. In Japan and Korea, if somebody kills themselves by jumping in front of a moving train, the family of the deceased are legally financially responsible for paying damages to the train company for cleanup, damage to equipment, psychological damage to the train passengers and operators, and lost time making the train late, making commuters late for their jobs. The same is true in cases when somebody steps into traffic and damages a car or bus, or if they jump off a building and create a mess on the ground. People who attempt suicide thus put themselves and their family in debt for the rest of their lives. This also means that failed attempts are likely to lead to successful attempts in the near future. However, while it's true that there is this huge stigma against suicide, people who successfully commit suicide get Buddhist funerals and memorials just like other people. Rituals are undertaken to facilitate the deceased person's favorable rebirth no less than if they died of old age or natural causes. This is different from Abrahamic religions, where it is pretty much a foregone conclusion that somebody who commits suicide has ended up in hell. Thus, the funerals and the memorials of those religious traditions have an extra layer of sadness, because the mourners live on with the belief that the person is suffering even in their next life for an eternity. Religion is for the living, especially when it considers the dead. It's a tool to ameliorate the fear of death and to propose a divinely or universally ordained order to be preserved and maintained by people. No matter the religion in question, there is a carrot and stick method. The carrot is the cosmic order that discourages suicide by encouraging heaven and helping people feel less upset that their loved ones have passed away because they're in some kind of better place. The stick is the threat of hell. It discourages suicide because such a thing is tragic and it hurts everyone, and it also erases any future possibility of recovery. We don't know what we experience after death, so we can only measure what happens in life, and suicide makes it so that life cannot change or improve in any way. Because death is a final and complete separation from a loved one, at least from our perspective, it is a very painful experience. Religions develop rituals and doctrines that ease that pain by implying that death isn't final, or that it represents an improvement on the current state of affairs, or so on and so forth. Relieving the pain of the living while simultaneously discouraging suicide creates some contradictions. On the one hand, the messaging is, don't kill yourself, because you will go to hell or be reborn in a bad place. And on the other hand, Buddhism then also eases the pain of people who have lost somebody to suicide by saying, this person is in a better place now, their suffering is ended, they're in a pure land or in a heaven. Thus, suicide is one of the most complicated and entangled and contradictory issues in religious doctrine as a whole, but also in philosophy, ethics, culture, society, politics, public health, and more. We're just two guys on the internet, so we won't be able to untangle that problem here on this show. It is an important one to consider in the context of religious doctrine in general and in Buddhism in particular.
It's also worth noting for the case of Buddhist ideas on what happens after suicide that bad karma at the end of one's life does not necessarily erase good karma done beforehand. So there is a level of comfort involved for the mourners that is not available in other religions that we're more familiar with. Buddhism can also offer comfort for people in mourning with rituals like merit transfer, which would apply to people who end their own lives like anyone else.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this week's discussion of suicide in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be discussing Satori in Japanese Buddhism. What is Satori? What happens when one attains it? How does one attain it? We hope to see you there.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Hi, Nick here. Just wanted to jump in at the top of the show to say big thank you to our two patrons, Tanner and Wooly. If you would like to join them, you can find us on patreon.com/brightonbuddhism, all one word. Thank you very much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, producer, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like for us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. please consider leaving a comment, a review, or subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Patreon at patreon.com/brightonbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.